We are attached to our body because we mistake it to be ourself, and we mistake it to be ourself only because we do not have a clear knowledge of what we really are. If we knew what we really are, we could not mistake ourselves to be what we are not. Conversely, until we know what we really are, we will be unable to free ourselves from all the mistaken notions that we now have about ourselves. Hence, so long as we continue to lack a clear and correct knowledge of ourselves, we will continue to mistake ourselves to be what we are not. Therefore, we cannot surrender ourselves entirely without first knowing our real self. That is, without actually experiencing our real nature or essential being. In other words, in order to surrender our false individual self, we must focus our entire attention upon our essential being in order to know what we really are. Thus, self-investigation is the only effective means by which we can surrender ourselves entirely. Therefore, in the 13th paragraph of Nan-yar, Sri Ramana defines true self-surrender by saying, being completely absorbed in Atmanishta, self-abidance, the state of just being as we really are, giving not even the slightest room to the rising of any thought other than Atma-chintana, the thought of our own real self, is giving ourselves to God. The term Atma-chintana literally means self-thought, or thought of ourself, but could perhaps be better translated as self-contemplation, because in this context the word chintana or thought does not actually mean thought in the sense of a mental activity. Our mind is active only when we attend to anything other than ourself, and all its activity will therefore cease when we try to think only of ourself. Thus, self-thought, or self-contemplation, is not actually an act of thinking, but is only a perfectly inactive state of thought-free self-attentiveness or self-consciousness. That is, when we try to think of ourself, our attention will be withdrawn from all other thoughts and will remain motionlessly focused on ourself. Thus, by thinking of ourself exclusively, we will avoid giving room to the rising of any other thought, and thereby will remain calmly absorbed in self-abidance, the thought-free state of just being our own real self. Since in this state of clear self-attentiveness or firm self-abidance, we do not rise as the separate thinking consciousness that we call our mind or individual self. This is the state of complete self-surrender. All action or doing, including our basic action of thinking or knowing thoughts, is a result of our failure to surrender our false individual self. We feel that we are thinking and doing other things only because we imagine ourselves to be this thinking mind and this doing body. That is, so long as we identify ourselves with our body, speech, or mind, we will feel that the actions of these instruments are being done by us. Everything that we experience ourselves doing, I am walking, I am talking, I am seeing, I am hearing, I am thinking, I am feeling, I am knowing, and so on, is an effect of our identification of ourself with our body, speech, senses, emotions, and mind. All our actions and all our dualistic knowledge arise only because we identify ourselves with these instruments of action and knowledge. This entire body-mind complex. Therefore, so long as we feel that we are doing anything or knowing anything other than our own essential self-conscious being I am, we have not surrendered our attachment to this body-mind complex or to our individual self, which identifies this complex as I. Since complete and perfect surrender is the state in which we have entirely renounced our individual self, and thus all connection with its body and mind, it is a state devoid of any action and any knowledge of duality. That which feels, I am doing, or I am knowing, is not our real self. but only our false individual self. The nature of our real self is just to be, not to do or know anything other than itself. Therefore, if we have truly surrendered our finite individual self, we will remain as mere being and will not feel that we are doing anything or knowing anything other than our own self-conscious being. The state of true surrender is therefore a state of just being and not a state of doing anything. Since perfect surrender is only the state of just being, the means to attain that state must also be just being. The practice of self-surrender is therefore the cultivation of the skill just to be, and not to be this or that. How can we cultivate this skill? According to the principles upon which the path of self-surrender is based, we can cultivate it by surrendering our individual will to the will of God, that is, by giving up all our own personal desires, because our desires are the power that impels us to do actions and thereby prevents us from just being. By cultivating the attitude, "Thy will be done, not my will, but only thine," we will be able gradually to reduce the strength of our own individual will, our likes and dislikes, our desires, attachments, and aversions, and thus we will begin to deprive our mind of the force or power that impels it to be active. The more we are able to reduce the power of our individual will, the more our mind will subside and the closer we will come to the state of just being. In order for us to surrender ourselves completely, we must give up all our desires. But is it possible for us to remain completely free of desire? Is it not natural for us to be always driven by some form of desire? Can we not surrender ourselves to God simply by giving up all our selfish desires and replacing them with unselfish desires? We can answer this last question only by understanding what we mean by an unselfish desire. Some people believe that if they are concerned only for the welfare of others, and that if they sacrifice all their own personal comforts and conveniences and dedicate all their time and money to helping other people, they are thereby acting unselfishly and without any personal desire. However, even if we are able to act in such an unselfish manner, which few, if any of us, are actually able to do, what actually impels us to do so? If we are perfectly honest with ourselves, we will have to admit that we act unselfishly for our own satisfaction. We feel good in ourselves when we act unselfishly, and therefore acting in this way makes us feel happy. Hence, our desire to be happy is what ultimately and truly motivates us to act unselfishly. There is therefore truly no such thing as an absolutely unselfish desire, because underlying even the most unselfish desire is our fundamental desire to be happy. We all desire to be happy. However, because we each have our own personal understanding of what makes us happy, we each seek happiness in our own individual way. All our actions, whether good or bad, moral or immoral, virtuous or sinful, saintly or evil, are motivated only by our desire for happiness. Whatever we may do and whatever effort we may make, we cannot avoid having the desire to be happy because that desire is inherent in our very being. Is it then impossible for us to be completely free of all desire? Yes, it is, or at least in a certain sense it is. If by the word desire we mean our basic liking to be happy, then yes, it is impossible for us ever to be free from it. However, our liking to be happy exists in two forms, one of which is correctly called love, and the other of which is correctly called desire. What then is the difference between our love to be happy and our desire to be happy? Love is the only suitable word that we can use to describe the liking to be happy that is inherent in our very being. Happiness is truly not anything extraneous to us, but is our very being, our own real self. Our liking for happiness is therefore in essence just our love for our own real self. We all love ourself, but we cannot say that we desire ourself. Desire is always for something other than ourself. We desire things that are other than ourself because we wrongly imagine that we can derive happiness from them. We can therefore use the word love to describe our liking to be happy when we do not seek happiness in anything outside ourselves. But when we seek happiness outside ourselves, our natural love to be happy takes the form of desire. Therefore, we can be completely free of desire only when our natural love of happiness is directed towards nothing other than our own essential being. We will never be able to free ourselves from the bondage of desire until we replace all our desire to acquire happiness from other things with an all-consuming love to experience happiness only in ourselves. In other words, we can transform all our finite desires into pure and infinite love only by diverting our liking for happiness away from all other things towards our own essential being. The obstacle that prevents us from surrendering ourselves entirely is our desire to obtain happiness from anything other than ourselves. But how does such desire arise in the first place? If our love just to be is our real nature, how have we forgotten such love and fallen a prey to the vultures of our desires? So long as we remain as our infinite consciousness of being, which is what we truly always are, we can experience nothing other than ourself. In such a state, nothing exists for us to desire, and therefore we are perfectly peaceful and happy in ourself. But as soon as we rise as the finite body-bound consciousness that we call our mind or individual self, we separate ourselves seemingly from the happiness that we truly are, and we experience things that seem to be other than ourself. Having separated ourselves from our own real self, which is infinite happiness and for which we therefore naturally have infinite love, we are overwhelmed by desire to regain that happiness. However, because we have forgotten what we really are, and because we see our own self as the many objects of this world, we are confused and imagine that we can obtain the happiness we desire from those objects. Due to the illusory appearance of duality or otherness, we experience both our natural happiness and our natural love for that happiness as two pairs of opposites, pleasure and pain, and desire and aversion. That is, we imagine that certain things get us pleasure or happiness, and that other things cause us pain or suffering, and therefore we feel desire for those things that seem to give us happiness and aversion for those things that seem to make us unhappy. Thus, the root cause of all our desire is our forgetfulness or ignorance of our own real self. When we ignore our true and infinite being, we imagine ourselves to be a false and finite individual, and therefore we experience things that seem to be other than ourselves, and feel desire for them, thinking that they can give us the happiness that we seem to have lost. Since our imaginary self-ignorance is the sole cause of all our desires, we can free ourselves from them only by regaining our natural state of true self-knowledge. Until we regain our true self-knowledge, we cannot remain free of desire. We may be able to replace our bad desires by good desires, but by doing so we will only be replacing our iron chains with golden ones. Whether the chains that bind us are made of iron or of gold, we will still be bound by them. Therefore, in order to experience true and perfect freedom, we must give up all our desires, both our base desires and our noble desires, which we can do only by knowing ourselves as we really are. Since we can achieve true and complete self-surrender only by experiencing non-dual self-knowledge, why is the path of self-surrender generally associated with dualistic devotion to God? Though Sri Ramana taught that we can surrender ourselves completely only by knowing our real self, even he often described self-surrender in terms of dualistic devotion, and he did so for a very good reason. In the 13th paragraph of Nanyar, for example, when defining true self-surrender as the state of thought-free self-abidance, he describes it as giving ourselves to God. And he goes on to explain the practice of self-surrender in terms of dualistic devotion to God. Being completely absorbed in self-abidance, giving not even the slightest room to the rising of any thought other than self-contemplation, is giving ourselves to God. Even though we place whatever amount of burden upon God, that entire amount he will bear. Since our Paramesvara Shakti, supreme power of God, is driving all activities, that is, since it is causing and controlling everything that happens in this world, why should we always think it is necessary for me to act in this way? It is necessary for me to act in that way, instead of being calm, peaceful, and happy, having yielded ourselves together with our entire burden to that supreme controlling power. Though we know that the train is carrying all the burdens, why should we who travel in it suffer by carrying our small luggage on our head instead of leaving it placed on that train? Why does Sri Ramana explain self-surrender in such dualistic terms? The necessity to surrender ourselves arises only when we mistake ourselves to be a finite individual. And in this state we experience all duality as if it were real. As we saw in Chapter 4, so long as we feel ourselves to be a finite person or individual consciousness, the world and God both exist as entities that are separate from us. God, as a separate being, is as real as our own separate individuality. Because we have limited ourselves as a finite individual, the infinite love and power, which is our own real self, appears to us to be separate from us, and therefore we give it the name God. It is this power of our own real self that Sri Ramana describes here as the one Paramesvara Shakti, the one supreme God power, or supreme ruling power. Everything that happens in this world happens only by the will of God, that is, by the love of this one supreme ruling power. Since God is all-knowing, nothing can happen without him knowing it. Since he is all-powerful, nothing can happen without his consent. And since he is all-loving, nothing can happen that is not for the true benefit of all concerned. Even though our limited human intellect may be unable to understand how each happening is truly good and beneficial, in fact, since he is the source and totality of all the power that we see manifest in this universe, every single activity or happening here is impelled, driven, and controlled by him. As an ancient Tamil proverb says, Avan arur andri oranuvum asayadu, which means, except by his grace, not even an atom moves. Since God is therefore bearing the entire burden of this universe, he can perfectly well bear any burden that we may place upon him. But what exactly do we mean when we speak of placing our burden upon him, and how can we do so? We all feel that we have some cares and responsibilities, but since God is responsible for everything, and since he is taking perfectly good care of everything, the truth is that we need not take any care or responsibility upon ourselves. Our only responsibility is to surrender ourselves to him. That is, to yield our individual will to his divine will, which simply means to give up all our personal desires, fears, likes and dislikes, and thereby to leave all our cares and worries in his perfectly capable hands. If we surrender our individual will in this manner, he will take perfect care of us and will bear all our responsibilities. However, our surrender does not have to be sincere. We should not delude ourselves by thinking we have surrendered to him and then indulging in irresponsible behavior. If we have truly surrendered our individual will to Him, He will prompt our mind, speech, and body to act in an appropriate fashion in every situation. But so long as we have any lurking desires, any likes or dislikes, we have to accept responsibility for any of our actions that result from such desires. However, even if we have not yet been able to relinquish all our desires, so long as we sincerely want to surrender to His will and make every effort to do so, we can be sure that He will guide our actions and safeguard us from falling a prey to the delusion, "I have surrendered myself to God." If we do think, "I have surrendered myself to God," we have still retained our individual I. So our so-called surrender is merely a self-deception. When we have truly surrendered ourselves to Him, we will not exist as an individual to think anything. We will have lost ourselves in the all-consuming fire of true self-knowledge, and therefore we will remain as mere being. Until such time, we should conduct ourselves with perfect humility, both inwardly and outwardly, and we should never imagine that we have gained any sort of spiritual achievement. So long as we are aware of any otherness or duality, anything other than our mere consciousness of our own being, we are still mistaking ourselves to be a finite individual, and hence we should understand that we have not truly surrendered ourselves or gained any worthwhile spiritual achievement. Avoiding any form of pride or self-delusion is an integral part of self-surrender. True self-surrender is total self-denial. As individuals, we are nothing, and we should understand ourselves to be nothing. Without the aid of God, we are absolutely powerless to do anything, even to surrender ourselves to Him. Therefore, if we truly wish to surrender to Him, we should pray for His aid, and should depend upon Him entirely to safeguard us from the self-deceptive rising of ego and pride. However, knowing our powerlessness and worthlessness, we should not feel dejected. As a finite, confused, and self-deluded mind, we truly cannot do anything to attain true self-knowledge. But why should we even imagine that we need to do anything? Our responsibility is not to do anything, but just to be. In order to be, we must reject our mind along with its sense of doership, and simply surrender ourselves to the supreme power of love that we call God. If we have even the slightest wish to surrender ourselves thus, He will give us all the aid that is necessary to make our surrender complete. In truth, even the iota of liking to surrender ourselves that we now have has been given to us by Him. And having given us this small taste of true love for the infinite being that is Himself, He will not cheat us by failing to nurture the seed of love that He has planted in our heart. Having planted this seed, He will surely nurture it and ensure that it grows to fruition, the state in which we are wholly consumed by our love for Absolute Being. Therefore, whenever we feel dejected, knowing how feeble is our love for just being, and how half-hearted are our attempts to surrender ourselves, we should console ourselves by praying to God in the manner shown to us by Sri Ramana in verse 60 of Sri Arunachala Aksharamanalame. Having shown to me, who am devoid of true love for you, a taste of desire for you, bestow your grace without cheating me, O Arunachala. Sri Ramana has composed many prayers like this, showing us how we should beseech God to help us in our efforts to attain the state of just being, because prayer is an important part of the process of self-surrender. God, of course, does not need to be told by us that we require His help, but that is not the true purpose of prayer. The purpose of prayer is to enkindle in our heart a sense of total dependence upon God. Since we cannot surrender ourselves and attain the state of being merely by our own effort, we must learn to depend entirely upon God, because He alone can enable us to surrender ourselves completely to Him. Moreover, since God exists in the core of our being as the core of our being, that is, as our own true self, whenever we pray to Him, we need not think of Him as some far-off being up in heaven, but can address our prayers to Him directly within ourselves, and thus we can make prayer one more opportunity to turn our attention towards our own innermost being. All the help that we need to enable us to attain the state of just being is available to us in our own heart, that is, in the core of our being, which is the true abode of God, the supreme power of love. To obtain all the divine aid or grace that we need not look anywhere other than in our own heart, our own real self or essential being. All our efforts, prayers, and attention should therefore be directed inwards towards our own being. This truth is clearly implied by Sri Ramana in verse 8 of Upadesa Undiyar. Rather than Anyabhava, Ananya Bhava, with the conviction he is indeed best among all forms of meditation. In this context, bhava means meditation, but also has the added connotation of opinion, attitude, or outlook, and anya means other, whereas ananya means non-other. Thus, the meaning implied by anyabhava is meditation upon God considering Him to be other than oneself, whereas that implied by ananyabhava is meditation upon God considering Him to be not other than oneself. This meaning of ananya bhava is further emphasized by the words He is I, which are placed in the apposition to it. Therefore, in whatever manner we may practice devotion to God, it is always better to consider Him to be our own real self, rather than considering Him to be other than ourself. The benefit of developing the attitude that God is our own real self or innermost being, and meditating upon Him, worshiping Him, or praying to Him accordingly, is explained by Sri Ramana in verse 9 of Upadesa Undiyar. By the strength of such meditation or attitude, being abiding or remaining in the state of being, which transcends all meditation, is alone the true state of supreme devotion. So long as we consider God to be other than ourself, whenever we think of Him, our attention will be directed outwards, away from ourself. But when we consider Him to be our own real self or essential being I am, whenever we think of Him, our attention will be directed inwards, towards the innermost core of our being. When our attention is directed away from ourself, our mind is active. But when our attention turns back to the core of our being, our mind becomes motionless and thereby subsides in the state of being, which transcends all thought or meditation. The state in which we thus remain subsided in the state of being is the true state of supreme devotion, because it is the state in which we have surrendered ourselves entirely to God, who is our own essential being. This state of just being, in which our mind or individual self has completely subsided, is not only the pinnacle of true devotion or love, but is also the ultimate goal and fulfillment of the other three spiritual paths, the paths of desireless action, union and knowing, as affirmed by Sri Ramana in verse 10 of Upadesa Undiyar. Being firmly established as our real self, having subsided in our rising place, the core of our being, which is the source from which we had risen as our mind, that is karma and bhakti, that is yoga and jnana. Though it is our mind that sets out to practice any of the four paths or types of a spiritual endeavor, namely the path of karma or action performed without desire for any reward, the path of bhakti or devotion, the path of yoga or union, and the path of jnana or knowing. Our mind is in fact the only obstacle that stands in the way of our achieving the goal of these four paths. Therefore, the final end of each of these paths can only be reached when our mind, which struggles to practice them, finally subsides in the state of being, which is the source from which it had originally risen. Thus, complete self-surrender is the true goal of all forms of spiritual practice. Even self-investigation, which is the true path of knowing or jnana, is necessary only because we have not yet surrendered ourselves completely. Since the correct practice of self-investigation is not doing anything, but just being, we cannot practice it correctly without surrendering ourself, our doing self or thinking mind. Conversely, since we cannot effectively surrender our false finite self without knowing what we really are, the correct practice of self-surrender is to keenly scrutinize ourselves and thereby to subside in the state of just being. Thus, in practice, self-investigation and self-surrender are inseparable from each other, like the two sides of a single sheet of paper. When we try to surrender ourselves, we have to be extremely vigilant to ensure that our mind or individual self does not surreptitiously rise to think of anything. Since our mind rises only when we think of or attend to anything other than ourself, we can prevent it from rising only by vigilantly attending to the source from which it rises, which is our own real self. When we thus attend vigilantly to our own innermost being, we will be able to detect our mind at the very moment it rises, and thus we will be able to crush its rising instantaneously. In fact, if we are vigilantly self-attentive, our mind will not be able to rise at all, because it actually rises only on account of our slackness in self-attention. To return once again to our discussion of the 13th paragraph of Nanyar, in the third sentence Sri Ramana asks, since one Paramesvara Shakti is driving all activities, why should we always think it is necessary for me to act in this way? It is necessary for me to act in that way, instead of having yielded to that. Besides what we have discussed already, there are two more important points to note in this sentence. Firstly, when he asks us why we should think that we need to do this or that, the meaning he implies is not only that it is unnecessary for us to do anything, but also that it is unnecessary for us to think anything. If we truly believe that God is doing everything and is always taking care of every living being, including ourselves, we will have the confidence to place upon him the burden of thinking for us, and thus we will be freed of the burden of thinking anything for ourselves. If we really surrender ourselves entirely to God, he will take full control of our mind, speech, and body, and will make them act in whatever way is appropriate to all situations. Only when we thus cease to think anything will our surrender to God be complete. Secondly, the words that I have translated as instead of having yielded to that are very significant, because they are an apt description of what real self-surrender is. In the original Tamil, the words used by Sri Ramana are adarku, adangi, iramal. The word adarku means to that or to it, that is, to the one Paramesvara Shakti or supreme ruling power. The word adangi is a past participle that means not only having yielded, but also having subsided, settled, shrunk, laid down, submitted, been subdued, become still, ceased, or disappeared. The word iramal means without being, or instead of being. Thus, the meaning implied by these words is that true self-surrender is a state of just being. That is, a state in which we remain as mere being, having yielded or submitted ourselves to God, and having thereby subsided, settled down, and become still, and having in fact ceased altogether to exist, as a separate individual. As we saw earlier, God is our own real self, and He appears to be separate from us only because we have limited ourself as a finite individual consciousness. In other words, as soon as we delude ourselves into imagining that we are a finite individual, our own real self manifests as God, the power that guides and controls our entire life as an individual, and that thereby gradually leads us back towards our natural state of true self-knowledge. However, God is not the only form in which our real self manifests to guide us back to itself. At a certain stage in our spiritual development, our real self also manifests as Guru, and in this form it reveals to us through spoken or written words the truth that we, ourself, are infinite being, consciousness and happiness, and that to experience ourself as such, we should scrutinize ourself and thereby surrender our false individual self. When we have once heard or read this truth revealed by our real self in the form of Guru, and if we have been genuinely attracted by this truth, we have truly come under the influence of Guru, and we are therefore well on our way to reaching our final goal of true self-knowledge. This state in which we have come under the influence of Guru is described by Sri Ramana in the 12th paragraph of Nanyar as being caught or ensnared in the glance of Guru's grace. God and Guru are in truth not different, just as that prey which has been caught in the jaws of a tiger will not return, so those who have been caught in the glance of Guru's grace will surely be saved by him and will never instead be forsaken. Nevertheless, it is necessary for them to proceed, behave, or act unfailingly according to the path that Guru has shown. Though the real Guru outwardly appears to be a human being, he is in fact God in human form, manifested as such in order to give us the spiritual teachings that are necessary to prompt us to turn our mind towards the source from which it has risen, and thereby to subside and merge in that source forever. Or to explain the same truth in another manner, since the person who had previously occupied the body in which Guru is manifested had surrendered himself entirely to God and had thereby been consumed in the fire of true self-knowledge, that which remains and functions through that body is only God himself. Therefore that which speaks, sees, hears, and acts through the human form in which the Guru is manifested is not a finite individual, but is the infinite power of love and true knowledge that we otherwise call God. This absolute oneness of God, Guru, and our own real self is the true significance of the Christian Trinity as explained by Sri Ramana. God, the Father, is God as the power that governs this whole universe and the life of each individual in it. God the Son is the Guru, and God the Holy Spirit is our own real self. Though in the limited and distorted outlook of our mind they appear to be three distinct entities or persons, God, Guru, and Self are in reality the one infinite and indivisible being. Though the word Guru is used in many different contexts and may therefore mean a teacher of any ordinary art, science, or skill, in spiritual context it correctly denotes only the Sadguru, the real Guru, or being Guru, that is the Guru who is Sat, the reality or true being of each one of us. Though there are many people who claim to be spiritual gurus, the true spiritual guru is very rare, and hence in a spiritual context the term guru should only be applied to those rare beings, like Buddha, Sri Krishna, Christ, Adi Shankara, Sri Ramakrishna, and Sri Ramana, who have a clear divine mission to reveal to us the path to attain true self-knowledge. No such real guru will ever claim to be the Guru, either explicitly or implicitly, because the real Guru is totally devoid of ego, and therefore knows himself only as I am, and not as I am God or I am Guru. Once we are caught in the influence of the real Guru, we are like the prey that has been caught in the jaws of a tiger. Just as a tiger will unfailingly devour the prey it has caught, so Guru will unfailingly devour us, destroying our mind or individual consciousness and thereby absorbing us into himself, that is, making us one with our own true and essential being, which is what he really is. However, Sri Ramana adds a cautionary note, saying that though Guru will surely save us in this manner and will never forsake us, we should nevertheless unfailingly follow the path that he has shown us. In the clause, it is necessary to proceed unfailingly according to the path that Guru has shown. The original Tamil word that I have translated as to proceed is nadakka, which means to walk, go, proceed or behave, and therefore it implies that we should conduct ourselves or act in accordance with his teachings, or in other words, we should unfailingly practice the twin path of self-investigation and self-surrender that he has taught us. The purpose of the manifestation of our real self in the human form of Guru is to teach us the means by which we can attain salvation, which is the state of true self-knowledge. It did not manifest itself as Guru merely for us to worship him as God, expecting him to bestow upon us any finite benefit or happiness, either in this world or some other world. The function of the Guru is the ultimate function of God, which is to destroy forever our illusion of individuality, our delusion that we are the body and mind that we now imagine ourselves to be, and that he performs this function by teaching us that we should turn our attention inwards, towards our innermost being, in order to know our real self and thereby surrender our false individual self. Therefore, if we truly wish to be saved from our own self-imposed delusion, we must unfailingly do as Guru has taught us, making every possible effort to attend to our essential being I am, and thereby to surrender our finite self in the infinity of that being or emness. The grace of God or Guru is always providing us the help we need to follow this spiritual path. But we must take full advantage of that help by turning our mind inwards and thereby remaining in our natural state of just being, which is the true state of self-investigation and self-surrender. God or Guru is always bestowing grace upon us by shining within us as I am, but we must reciprocate that grace or love by attending to I am. The reason why we have not attained salvation is that we continue to ignore the true form of grace, which ever shines within us as I am. As Sri Ramana says in verse 966 of Guru Vachaka Kovai, since Uladu, the absolute reality, being or that which is, alone, is the true form or Tiruvarul, divine grace, which rises clearly and prominently within each one of us as Ulam, our heart, core or essential consciousness M. The fault of ignoring or disregarding that which is suited to be considered as a defect that belongs only to individuals who do not unceasingly think, remember, or attend to this grace which shines lovingly as M, inwardly melting with love for it. Instead, how can the fault of not bestowing sweet grace be considered as a defect that belongs to God or Guru, who is that which is? Being ungracious, unloving, unkind, or unhelpful is a fault that can be blamed only upon us individuals, who ignore and disregard the infinite and absolute reality, Uladu, being, or that which is, which shines within us effulgently as M or I am, and not upon God or Guru, who is that reality. God or Guru never ignores us, but constantly shines within us as our own being or emness, beckoning us lovingly to turn within and merge in him. However, though he is always making himself so easily available to us, we choose to ignore him constantly and to attend instead to our thoughts about our petty life as an individual in this imaginary world. For us to attain salvation, only two things are necessary: the grace of God or Guru, and our own willingness to submit to that grace. Of these two indispensable ingredients, the former is always abundantly available, and only the latter is lacking. Until we are perfectly willing to surrender and lose our individuality, God or Guru will never force us, but he will be constantly nurturing the seed of such willingness or love in our heart, helping it to grow until one day it consumes us. Therefore, though Guru will certainly save us and will never forsake us, it is essential that we should do our part, which is to submit ourselves willingly to his grace, which is the perfect clarity of our own fundamental self-consciousness, our absolutely non-dual consciousness of our own being, I am. The only way we can thus submit or surrender ourselves to his grace is to think of or constantly attend to our own essential self-conscious being, I am, melting inwardly with overwhelming love for it. Sincerely attempting to surrender ourselves in this manner is what Sri Ramana meant when he said, "Nevertheless, it is necessary to proceed unfailingly according to the path that Guru has shown. In order to know our own real self, which is absolute, infinite, eternal, and undivided being consciousness bliss or Satchitananda, we must be willing to surrender or renounce our false finite self. And in order to surrender our false self, we must be wholly consumed by an overwhelming love to know and to be our own real self or essential being. So long as we feel complacent about our present condition, in which we have imaginarily limited ourselves as this finite mind and body, we will lack the intense motivation that we must have in order to be sufficiently willing to surrender our false self. Since we now imagine our mind and body to be ourself, our attachment to them is very strong, and hence we will not be willing to surrender this attachment unless we are very strongly motivated to do so. Our attachment to our mind and body is so strong that it induces us to delude ourselves into a deceptive state of complacency, making us feel that our present condition is not as intolerable as it really is. Rather than recognizing the fact that the deep dissatisfaction that we feel with our present condition as a finite, body-bound individual consciousness is an inevitable consequence of our imaginary separation of ourselves from the infinite happiness that is our own real nature, and that we can therefore never overcome this dissatisfaction by any means other than true self-knowledge, that is, other than experiencing ourselves as the adjunct-free, infinite, undivided, and therefore absolutely non-dual real self-consciousness I am, we complacently continue our life as a body-bound individual, imagining that we can achieve the happiness that we seek by enjoying the petty, transient pleasures that we experience by satisfying any of our countless temporal desires. This self-deceptive complacency is a serious problem that all true spiritual aspirants experience, and we must overcome it if we truly wish to surrender our false self and thereby to know our real infinite self. Since this deep-rooted complacency is an inevitable consequence of our having succumbed to our power of Maya or self-delusion, which is the power that causes us to imagine ourselves to be this finite body and mind, we normally cannot overcome it unless we experience an intense internal crisis, such as being suddenly confronted by a profound inward fear of death. Therefore, when we reach a certain stage of spiritual maturity, the power of grace will generally induce us to experience some such internal crisis. And when we experience it, we will be shocked out of our present sense of complacency, and will therefore turn our attention selfwards with intense love to know what we really are. In the life of Sri Ramana, such an internal crisis occurred in the form of the sudden intense fear of death that he experienced when he was a 16-year-old boy. As we saw in the introduction to this book, this intense fear prompted him to turn his attention inwards to discover whether he was really the body, which is subject to death. So intensely did he focus his attention upon his innermost being, his essential self-consciousness, I, that he experienced it with perfect clarity. And thus, he came to know from his own direct experience that he was not the mortal body, but was only the immortal, eternal, and infinite spirit, which is absolutely non-dual being, consciousness, and bliss. Sri Ramana describes this experience of his in the second of the 2 verses of Mangalam, or auspicious introduction to Uladu Narpadu. Those mature people who have intense fear of death will take refuge at the feet of God, who is devoid of death and birth, depending upon him and as their protective fortress. By their surrender, they experience death, the death or dissolution of their finite self. With those who are deathless, having died to their mortal self, and having thereby become one with the immortal spirit, approach the death thought or thought of death ever again. Though the Tamil word literally means either those or beauty, I have translated it here as those mature, because in this context the beauty that it denotes is the true beauty of spiritual maturity, which is the truly desirable condition in which our mind has been cleansed of most of its impurities, namely its cruder forms of desire, and is therefore ready to surrender itself entirely to God. The fear of death is naturally inherent in all living beings, but it usually remains in a dormant form because we spend most of our time thinking about our life in this world, and hence we seldom think about death. Even when some external event or some internal thought reminds us that we will sooner or later die, our fear of death seldom becomes intense, because the thought of death prompts us to think of the things in our life to which we are most strongly attached. However, though it usually remains in a dormant form, our fear of death is in fact the greatest, most fundamental, and most deeply rooted of all our fears. We fear death because it appears to us to be a state of non-existence, a state in which we ourselves will cease to exist, or at least cease to exist as we now know ourselves. Since we love our own being or existence more than we love any other thing, we fear to lose our own being or existence more than we fear any other thing. In other words, our fear of death is rooted in our self-love, our basic love for our own essential self or being. The reason why we love our own self or being is that we ourselves are happiness. Because by our very nature we love happiness, and because happiness is in fact our own being, we cannot avoid loving our own being or existence, and hence we cannot avoid fearing the loss or destruction of our being or existence. Therefore, so long as we experience ourselves as a physical body, that is, so long as we confuse our existence with the existence of a mortal body, we cannot avoid having a deep-rooted fear of death. Hence, the fear of death will always exist in us until we truly decide to free ourselves from our self-created illusion that we are a mortal body. Because we imagine ourselves to be this body, we are unavoidably attached to it, and therefore we fear to lose it. However, though we all know that one day our body will die, and that death can come at any time. Our power of Maya, or self-delusion, lulls us into a state of complacency, making us imagine that death is far away, or that we do not really fear death. Though we may imagine that we do not fear death, if our life is put in sudden danger, we will certainly respond with intense fear. However, as soon as the immediate danger is past, our fear will subside, and we will continue our life in our usual state of self-deceptive complacency. Though we experience intense fear of death whenever the life of our body is in extreme danger, the intensity of that fear is short-lived. It is not sustained because when we are confronted with death, we react by thinking of our loved ones, our friends, our material possessions, our status in life, and other such external things to which we are attached, and which we consequently fear to lose. Even our religious beliefs can be a means by which we sustain the comfort of complacency. If we believe, for example, that after the death of our body we will go to some other world called heaven, where we will be reunited with all our loved ones and friends, and where we will live with them an eternal life, free from all suffering, that belief will help us to ward off our fear of death. Even if we have some less optimistic belief about life after death, so long as our belief is sufficiently comforting, as most such beliefs are, it will help us to feel complacent about the certainty of death. So long as we lack true spiritual maturity or freedom from desire for anything external, the fear of death will impel our mind to rush outwards to think of our life in this world or the next, and due to such thoughts our attention will be diverted away from the thought of death, and thus our fear will lose its intensity. However, when we eventually gain true spiritual maturity, our reaction to the thought of death will be different. If we are spiritually mature, the intensity of our desire for and attachment to external things, either in this world or the next, will be greatly reduced. Therefore, when we think of death, we will not fear to lose any external thing, but will only fear to lose our own existence or being, since the last vestiges of our desire and attachment will be centered on our own very existence as an individual, and since we confuse our existence with the existence of whatever body we currently imagine ourselves to be, when the thought of the death of our body arises within us, our mind will turn inwards to cling to its own existence or essential being. That is what happened in the case of Sri Ramana. When the thought of death suddenly arose within him, his reaction was to turn his attention within, towards his own very being, in order to discover whether he himself would die, along with the death of his body. Because his attention was focused so keenly on his own essential being or emness, he clearly experienced himself without any superimposed adjunct, such as his mind or body. And thus he discovered that his real self was not a mortal body or a transient mind, but was only the infinite, eternal, birthless, and deathless spirit, the one true non-dual consciousness of being, which always knows I am and nothing other than I am. In the first sentence of this second Mangalam verse of Uladu Narpadu, Sri Ramana says, "Those mature people who have intense fear of death will take refuge at the feet of Maharshi, the great Lord, who is devoid of death and birth, depending upon him as their protective fortress." This is a poetic way of describing his own experience of self-investigation and self-surrender. Though the word Maharshi, which literally means the great Lord, is a name that usually denotes Lord Shiva, the form in which many Hindus worship God, Sri Ramana did not use it in this context to denote any particular form of God, but only as an allegorical description of the birthless and deathless spirit, which always exists in each one of us as our own essential self-conscious being I am. No name or form of God is truly devoid of birth or death, appearance or disappearance, because like all other names and forms, the various names and forms in which devotees worship God are transitory appearances. They can appear only when our mind has risen to know them, and they disappear when our mind subsides. Therefore, in this context, the words, "the great Lord who is devoid of death and birth," do not denote merely the saguna or qualified aspect of God, that is, God as he is conceived by our finite mind, but only his essential nirguna or unqualified aspect, that is, God as he really is, which is the nameless and formless absolute reality, our own true self-conscious being which always knows its own existence without ever appearing or disappearing. However, though in this context Sri Ramana is not actually describing any form of saguna upasana or worship of God in name and form, by using the word Mahasan, which is a personal name of God, he does allude to such worship. This allusion is intentional, because if we worship God in name and form with true heart-melting devotion, our mind will gradually be purified or cleansed of its cruder forms of desire, and thus it will eventually gain the maturity that is required for it to be able to surrender itself entirely to him. However, no matter how much we may worship God in name and form, we cannot achieve the final goal of the path of devotion, which is the complete surrender of ourself to him, until we turn our attention inwards to worship him in the profound depth of our own heart, in the innermost core of our being, as our own true and essential being. In other words, in order for us to attain the true goal of saguna upasana, or worship of God in name and form, such worship must eventually flower into nirguna upasana, which is the true worship of God as the one nameless and formless absolute reality which always exists within us as our own essential self-conscious being. We can experience God as he really is only when we turn our mind inwards, away from all names and forms which are merely thoughts that we have formed in our mind by our power of imagination, and thereby allow it to dissolve in the absolute clarity of our own true and essential self-conscious being, which is the true form or nature of God. However, in order to turn our mind inwards and thereby surrender it completely in the all-consuming light of God's own true being, we must have overwhelming love for him, and such love is cultivated by the practice of saguna upasana or dualistic worship. However, though the true love that we require in order to be willing to surrender ourselves entirely in the absolute clarity of pure self-conscious being, which is the reality of both God and ourself, can be cultivated gradually by the practice of dualistic devotion, the quickest and most effective way to cultivate it is by the practice of non-dualistic devotion, that is, by the practice of self-attentiveness, which is the true adoration of God as our own real self or essential being. Whether we cultivate the true love or willingness to surrender ourselves entirely to the absolute reality, which is the infinite fullness of being that we call God, by dualistic devotion or by non-dualistic devotion, once we have cultivated it sufficiently, any internal crisis, such as an intense fear of death, would impel our mind to turn inwards and to sink into the innermost depth of our own being in order to surrender itself entirely to him. Only when our mind thus merges in the source from which it had risen, which is our own true and essential self-conscious being, will its surrender to God become complete. This complete surrender of our mind or individual self in the innermost depth of our own being is what Sri Ramana describes in this verse by the words, "We'll take refuge at the feet of God who is devoid of death and birth, depending upon him as their protective fortress. In Hindu devotional poetry and literature, the adoration of God is often described as bowing to his feet, falling at his feet, clinging to his feet, taking refuge in or at his feet, and so on, because such actions imply humility, devotion, and submission. Therefore, in Indian languages, the term feet has come to be synonymous with God as the ultimate object of worship or adoration. Moreover, as Sri Ramana often explained, the term the feet of God is an allegorical description of his true state, the egoless and perfectly non-dual state of unalloyed self-conscious being, which always shines within each one of us as I am. In order to remind us that we can experience God as he really is only in the core of our own being, he always emphasized the truth that the feet of God cannot be found outside, but only within ourselves. On one occasion, when a lady devotee bowed before him and caught hold of his feet, saying, "I am clinging to the feet of my Guru," he looked at her kindly and said, "Are these feet of Guru? The feet of Guru are that which is always shining within you as I. Grasp that." Therefore, the words, "those mature people will take refuge at the feet of God," mean that they will lovingly subside in the innermost depth of their own being, where they will experience God as their own real self. The only true refuge or fortress which will protect us from the fear of death and every other form of misery is the innermost core of our own being, which is the real abode of God, and which, being the foundation that underlies and supports our mind and everything known by it, is figuratively described as his feet. In the second sentence of this verse, Sri Ramana says, "By their surrender, they experience death. The death that they previously feared was the death of their body. But when the fear of that death impels them to take refuge at the feet of God, they experience death of an entirely different kind. That is, when they take refuge at the feet of God by subsiding into the innermost depth of their own being, they will experience the absolute clarity of unadulterated self-consciousness, which will swallow their mind just as light swallows darkness. Our mind, or finite individual self, is an imagination, a false form of consciousness that experiences itself as a body, which is one of its own imaginary creations. We imagine ourselves to be this mind only because we ignore or fail to attend to our own true and essential being. If we knew what we really are, we could not mistake ourselves to be any other thing. Hence, since our mind has come into existence because of our imaginary self-ignorance, it will be destroyed by the experience of true self-knowledge. Therefore, when we subside into our heart, the innermost core of our own being, where our true self-consciousness shines free from all adjuncts, all thoughts, all imaginations, all duality, and all forms of limitation, our mind will disappear in the absolute clarity of that pure self-consciousness, just as our imaginary snake will disappear when we clearly see that what we mistook to be that snake is in fact only a rope. Because our mind is a false knowledge about ourself, an imagination that we are a material body, the experience of true self-knowledge will reveal that it is unreal. Therefore, the death that we will experience when we surrender our false individual self and the absolute clarity of true self-knowledge, which always shines in the innermost core of our being, is the death of our own mind. The death of our body is not a true death, because when our body dies, our mind will create for itself another body by its power of imagination. As long as our mind survives, it will continue thus creating for itself one body after another. Hence, the only true death is the death of our own mind. However, Though the experience of true self-knowledge is figuratively described as the death or destruction of our mind, we should not imagine that this implies that our mind has ever really existed. The death of our mind is like the death of a snake that we imagine we see in the dim light of night. In the morning, when the sun rises, that imaginary snake will disappear, because we will clearly see that it is in fact only a rope. Similarly, in the clear light of true self-knowledge, our mind will disappear, because we will clearly recognize that it is in fact only our infinite and non-dual consciousness of our own essential being. Just as the snake does not really die because it never actually existed, so our mind will not really die because it has never actually existed. Its death is real only relative to its present seeming existence. Therefore, though in figurative terms the experience of true self-knowledge may be described as the death of our unreal self and as the birth of our real self, in reality, it is the state in which we know that our real self alone exists, that it has always existed, and that our mind or unreal self has never truly existed. In the third and final sentence of this verse, Sri Ramana says, "Will those who are deathless approach the death thought?" Here the word savadavar, which means those who do not die, or those who are deathless, denotes those who have surrendered themselves entirely to God, thereby dying as their mind or mortal self, and thus becoming one with the immortal spirit, the infinite and eternal self-consciousness I am, which is the true and essential being of both God and ourself. The rhetorical question, will they approach the death thought, is an idiomatic way of saying that they will never again experience any thought of death. Death is just a thought, as also is the fear of death. We can think of death and experience fear of it only when we imagine ourselves to be a mortal body. Our body, its birth, and its death are all mere thoughts or imaginations. When we imagine that we are this body, we accordingly imagine that we were born at some time in the past and that we will die at some time in the future. Who or what imagines all this? Only our mind imagines these and all other thoughts. If our mind is real, these thoughts are also real. But if we keenly scrutinize our mind to see whether it is real, it will disappear, and only our own essential self-conscious being will remain as the eternal and deathless reality. Our mind, which imagines the existence of our body, its birth and its death, is itself a mere thought or imagination. It is a phantom that comes into existence only by imagining itself to be a mortal body, and though it will disappear when this body dies, just as it disappears every day in sleep, it will reappear by imagining itself to be some other body, just as it reappears in a dream or on waking from sleep. It will reappear by imagining itself to be some other body. It will itself die or disappear permanently only when we surrender it in the absolute clarity of true self-knowledge. Since death is a thought, and even the thinker of death is a thought, the true state of deathlessness or immortality is only the thought-free state of absolutely clear self-conscious being, the state in which our thinking mind has died. When by our complete self-surrender we abide permanently in this egoless and mind-free state of true immortality, we will never again be able to imagine the thought of death or any other thought. Thus, in this verse, Sri Ramana describes both the goal and the means to attain that goal. The goal is the state of immortality, in which our thinking, fearing, and desiring mind has died. And the means by which we attain that goal is complete self-surrender, which we can achieve only by subsiding within ourselves and taking refuge there in the birthless and deathless absolute reality, which is our own essential self-conscious being I am. As we have been seeing throughout this chapter, the essence of both self-investigation and self-surrender is just being. So long as we feel ourselves to be thinking or doing anything, our attention is not focused entirely upon our own being, and therefore we have not yet surrendered ourselves entirely to God. The essence of all spiritual practice can be summarized in 2 words: just be. However, though these 2 words are the most accurate possible description of the only means by which we can attain the infinitely happy experience of true self-knowledge, most of us are unable to understand their full significance, and therefore we wonder how we can just be. We are so accustomed to doing and to considering that we cannot achieve anything without doing something that we tend to think, what must I do in order to just be? Even if we have understood that being is not doing anything, and that we therefore cannot do anything in order to be, we still wonder how we can refrain from thinking or doing anything. To save us from all this confusion, Sri Ramana gave us a simple clue to enable us to be without doing anything. That is, he taught us that in order to be without doing anything, all we need do is to focus our entire attention upon ourself, that is, upon our own essential being, I am. Though this practice of focusing our attention upon our being may appear to be a doing, the only doing that it actually involves is the withdrawing of our attention from all other things, because once our attention is thus withdrawn and allowed to settle on itself, all doing will have ceased and only being will remain. Moreover, though this withdrawing of our attention from all other things towards our own innermost being may appear to be a doing or action, it is actually not so, because in practice it is just a subsiding and cessation of all activity. That is, since our mind rises and becomes active only by attending to things other than itself, when it withdraws its attention back towards itself, it subsides, and all its activity or doing ceases. Thus, this clue of self-attention, which Sri Ramana has given us, is an infallible means by which we can make our mind subside in our natural state of just being. This subsiding of our mind in our natural state of being is what is otherwise known as complete self-surrender. True self-surrender is a conscious and voluntary cessation of all mental activity, and what remains when all our distracting thoughts have thus subsided is the clear and undisturbed consciousness of our own true being. Therefore, just as self-attentiveness automatically results in self-surrender, so self-surrender automatically results in self-attentiveness, which is the true practice of self-investigation. In fact, though we speak of self-investigation and self-surrender as if they were 2 different practices, they are not actually so, but are merely 2 seemingly different approaches to the same practice, which is the practice of just being. Just being, that is, with full consciousness of our being. What exactly do we mean when we describe them thus as different approaches? Though in actual practice they are one and the same, they differ only in there being 2 different ways of conceptualizing and describing the one practice of just being. Whereas self-investigation is the practice of just being conceived in more strictly philosophical terms, self-surrender is the same practice conceived in more devotional terms. However, this distinction is not a rigid one, because when understood correctly from a deeper and broader perspective, self-investigation and self-surrender are in fact both based upon the same broad philosophy, and are both motivated by the same deep love and devotion. It is only in the view of people who have a superficial and narrow understanding of philosophy and devotion, and who therefore see them as being fundamentally different viewpoints, that this seeming distinction exists. If, however, we are able to recognize that philosophy and wholehearted devotion to the absolute truth are essentially the same thing, we will understand that there is really no difference between self-investigation and self-surrender. Therefore, since self-investigation and self-surrender are two names given to the same practice of self-attentive being, let us now consider this practice, or art of being, in greater depth.